What if I told you that while every country claims to be sovereign, there exists a hidden empire pulling the strings through debt, quietly owning entire nations? Imagine governments, large and small, borrowing billions, believing they remain in control, only to discover the real creditor isn't who they thought. Today we unfold the covert system of global debt, how central bankers, bond markets, financial institutions, and hidden pools of capital became the owners of countries. Stay with me, because the truth will challenge everything you thought about money, power, and freedom. For centuries, rulers borrowed money to fight wars, build empires, or finance public works. Venice issued the first public debt in the 12th century. Fast forward to the 20th century, governments issue bonds, central banks intervene, and global capital moves at the speed of light. Behind the scenes, bond traders, sovereign wealth funds, central bankers, and financial institutions quietly accumulate claims on states. These claims are not just money owed, they become levers of influence. The question, who really owns these debts? And how did this system evolve into an empire of credit? Central banks, institutions like the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, or the European Central Bank act as issuer, banker, and creditor. Sovereign wealth funds and foreign central banks, countries like Japan and China hold trillions in foreign government bonds, effectively lending to other nations. Congress.gov, private financial markets, mutual funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and private investors hold government debt as tradable assets. Peterson Foundation together. These players transformed government debt from a domestic obligation into a global asset class. The result? Many nations borrowed not just from their people, but from an invisible global creditor network. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European governments sold bonds to finance wars. Creditors gained leverage. Borrowers gained obligations. Over time, borrowing became normalized. In the 20th century, particularly after World War II, the US dollar emerged as the global reserve currency. Countries accumulated dollars and invested them in US Treasury securities. Japan and China, for example, became large holders of US debt. As global trade expanded, so did cross-border lending and borrowing. Government debt became a commodity for investors worldwide. Governments competed for capital. Creditors competed for yield. Sovereigns lost exclusivity over their credit. Debt became global, fungible, and detachable from national borders. Central banks expanded their roles. They purchased government debt, set interest rates, controlled money supply. The issuance of debt transformed into a tool not just of finance but of governance. Intrapublic debt, government owed to government, ballooned, blurring lines between creditor and borrower. By the 2000s, government bonds were bought by pension funds, insurance companies, foreign governments, and central banks. The U.S. example of its tilde. $36 trillion debt, roughly $9 trillion, about 25 to 30% is held by foreign entities. Al Jazeera domestic ownership remains large, but significant portions rest in private portfolios and institutional holdings. Debt ceased to be simply what governments owed citizens. It became financial assets that global investors owned. The creditor class gained power. The debtor nations gained vulnerability. When a country borrows, it pledges future revenue. Major creditors can demand conditions, interest rates, austerity, reforms. International organizations, IMF, World Bank, intervene in sovereign debt crises, effectively disciplining borrowers. In this sense, the creditor empire uses debt to influence national policies. For example, Japan's government debt exceeds 200% of GDP, yet most of it is domestically held. But the system shows how debt becomes structural. The global system matured, debt issuance, global investors, central banks, and policy influence fused into a unified mechanism of economic control. Crises demonstrate how power shifts. When borrowers cannot service debt, creditors gain direct control. The 2010s European debt crisis provides examples. Greece, Italy, and others had to submit to external conditions to access relief. In the U.S. example, the national debt reached over $36 trillion in 2025, surpassing earlier projections by years. This spike signals a system under stress. When debt outpaces growth, control can shift from democratic bodies to creditor markets. When nations borrow heavily, they trade away independence, interest payments, foreign holdings, policy constraints. The hidden empire, countries, funds, and banking institutions with capital control weaker debtor states. In effect, debt becomes ownership, or at least control by another actor. Interest payments reduce fiscal flexibility. In the U.S., rapidly rising debt means future budgets will devote larger shares to interest rather than services. In debtor nations globally, austerity. Privatization and pension reforms accompany bailout conditions, all symptoms of creditor power. Debt servicing can redirect national sovereignty from public policy to market discipline. Consider. When a country cannot issue its own currency or freely set interest rates, debt investors effectively control policy. Creditors can dictate terms, structural reforms, fiscal austerity, asset sales. This isn't explicit colonization, but functional control. The sovereignty of debtor nations is compromised. They remain self-governing only to an extent. Thus, the idea of a hidden empire becomes clearer, one built not on armies, but on bonds and loans. Debt relief programs, restructuring deals, and bailout packages attempt to reset the debtor-creditor relationship, yet they often come with conditions: oversight, privatization, fiscal controls. The outcome: the debtor still operates under creditor oversight. Quantitative easing and central bank purchases: when central banks buy their own government's bonds, they blur creditor-debtor lines. For example, the U.S. Federal Reserve became a major holder of the national debt, increasing from $1 trillion in 2010 to over $6 trillion in 2022. However, this internal ownership does not restore full sovereignty. It may reduce interest costs but expands monetary risk. Some argue that countries with their own fiat currency like Japan or the U.S. cannot be forced into default in the same way as Eurozone countries. Yet Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio over 200% Wikipedia and the U.S. hitting $37 trillion debt show limits to this logic. The fixes postpone but do not dismantle the hidden empire. The U.S. is a case study. U.S. federal debt, $36 trillion in early 2025. Foreign holdings, approximately 25 to 30% of publicly held debt. Japan, China, and the UK among top holders. Domestic holdings, including the Federal Reserve, pension funds, mutual funds, millions of individual investors depend on government bonds. Thus, the world's largest borrower is also exposed to a network of creditors spanning governments and private sector. Many countries' debt-to-GDP ratios exceed 100%, UK approximately 100%, Japan greater than 200%. The logic of borrowing more to pay interest on previous debt, a spiral that deepens dependency. Hidden empire indicators: when a central bank holds its own government's debt, the line between creditor and debtor blurs. When foreign nations hold large chunks of another state's debt, leverage shifts to the creditor. When constitutional or treaty obligations limit debtors' policy space, Eurozone, IMF conditionality, sovereignty is functionally reduced. Why it matters to you: government debt can impact inflation, interest rates, tax burdens, and public spending. In the U.S., the growing debt has been linked to higher interest costs, reduced investment, and increased pressures on households. Al Jazeera: as individual investors and citizens, our financial futures are tied to complex creditor-debtor networks we rarely see. Recognizing that you may live in a country beholden, at least partially, to a global creditor structure changes the narrative of national independence and economic control. Debt isn't just money owed, it can represent control. When a nation borrows, it becomes subject to the interests of the creditor. Creditor power is global, hidden, and underestimated. From bond markets to foreign governments, the web of owners of national debt constitutes a kind of empire, one without flags, but with leverage. Sovereignty is more than legal independence, it's financial freedom. When debt obligations dictate policy, national strategy becomes hostage to capital. As governments continue to borrow and central banks expand their balance sheets, the risk of losing control over key levers of society increases. We may not see armies on our borders, but we may soon see rules shaped by those who hold the bonds and loans behind the scenes. Ask yourself, how independent is your country when it owes trillions to entities you've never met? If you found this story eye-opening, hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe for more deep dives into money history, global debt and financial secrets. Leave a comment. Which country's debt story surprised you the most? Let's reveal the empire together.